When discussing our region, few people come with such impeccable credentials as Dr. Marvin Weinbaum. He's Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan Studies at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Weinbaum served as analyst for our region in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. For 15 years, Dr. Weinbaum led a program for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois. He is author or editor of 6 books and has written innumerable articles for leading journals worldwide. Dr. Weinbaum studied at the University of Michigan and earned his doctorate from Columbia University. Dr. Weinbaum, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. Dr. Weinbaum, do you think there's a trend worldwide for a narrow definition of identity based on race or religion? How dangerous is that trend?
Well, I think the trend is certainly recognizable. The trend has been, I think, developing for some time. There have been casualties in the process of globalization, and some of the reaction to it has been to resort really to more tribalistic kinds of identities, such as one finds in race and religion as well. But other identities, local, provincial identities, also fit in this category. It's been a developing process. However, what we're seeing now is an acceleration of that. And I think that is because we're seeing a growth here of something which fits together very well with this trend, and that is the growth of nationalism, which is often based on the majority's view in various states, whether it's a religious view or a ethnic view, racial view. This has been strengthening and is identified with the state. The result of this, of course, is that we're getting a kind of government which is more insular, it's more self-reliant, and we're seeing this certainly with the United States in the election of President Trump here in his terminology of America first. And this, I think, has accelerated for the United States what was really in the past the isolationist view was very much out of vogue. Well, it came back into vogue in a strong way with President Trump, although I think the trend lines were moving in this direction in any event.
Yes, okay. So we may have entered a period in history in which USA is no longer considered a world leader, and yet there is no other country that can fill in that role. What are the dangers involved in a world without an anchor?
Well, this is particularly follows on what I was just saying. For much certainly of the post-war period since the Second World War, the United States has assumed that role of global leadership. Large part of it was that it came out of that war in far better shape than any of the other countries that were major players on the world scene. And it maintained that, and as a result of U.S., I think, by and large, enlightened view, there was the creation here of international institutions, which both as economic institutions and political, which were designed here to strengthen a world economy and to at least improve the possibility of peace. It didn't entirely succeed. There have been wars over this period of time, of course, but what we haven't seen here is the kind of global catastrophe that we had seen previously, and we saw 20 years before that in the First World War. Well, that was really to create a kind of balance of power in one sense, but in the larger sense, it was really the hegemony of the United States, which could have been used, I think, in any number of ways, and some ways in which it did use was unfortunate. The United States did not always make good choices, but in the establishment of these institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, of course, the United Nations, and all of its agencies, the World Bank, and many regional organizations which were in some ways mimicking these institutions. These were a real strength, and they created a world order here, again, which wasn't always fair, but it was generally fair enough that people adhered to it. And those institutions are fragile if governments don't want to cooperate. And what we're seeing now is the United States stepping away from that role, and stepping away because, in part, it could not maintain entirely this kind of unipolar world that it had accustomed itself to. But nevertheless, in doing that, the United States has not been there to defend those institutions, or in the case of our current president now, to even tear down those institutions, to suggest that the United States can go it alone, and in fact that these institutions are unfair to the United States and have to be discounted to a great degree.
So do you think the pandemic, the experience of pandemic, could bring about more cooperation and understanding amongst countries, even though at present there are different voices? Do you think the United States will play a leading role after the pandemic?
It's very important. One would hope that when you're facing a common enemy which knows no national boundaries, that this would be the occasion here for pulling together, for working cooperatively. Imagine an invasion from Mars, and countries realize that they're all in it together to defend the planet. Well, we're in that position here, but it doesn't, in the context that we were just speaking, where countries now, not just the United States, are sort of receding into their national and often tribal identities. This, rather than lending itself to this kind of cooperation, can detract from it. Now, there is cooperation going on internationally. I don't want to underestimate that. Yes, President Trump has attacked the World Health Organization, and it hasn't always done the right thing. Naturally, we can argue that about all of these institutions, but it's a vital institution now for just the kind of coordinating role that I think you're speaking of here, where countries work together. And this is, again, part of this erosion of a world order. And what has happened, unfortunately, is that it has affected governance, the pandemic. It's affected governance because as it requires leadership, throughout the world we see cases here where leaders are abusing this kind of power which they've got to exercise and are moving in more autocratic directions. They are taking advantage of the challenges, the threats, the fears, and they have played on them, and they have accumulated or are in the process of accumulating greater power, which one worries about. Even if it's necessary in times of emergency, they will not easily relinquish. And so we have a growth here. I think we're seeing it certainly in locations in Europe, your neck of the woods, South Asia. But we're seeing it everywhere, where rather than seeing the growth of democratic institutions, we're seeing the growth here of more autocratic institutions under the guise of the people's safety.
After the pandemic? Do you think that trend of autocracy will continue after the pandemic?
Well, that's the question. It's often hard to get these leaders and their followers, their immediate followers, to relinquish power that they've accumulated. It's much easier to accumulate power than it is to be willing to relinquish it. And this is the concern. And some of the changes that they make are institutional changes and would be difficult to simply reverse. So I think we have to be on the alert for this. But I must say it's very disappointing to see in countries that have made some real strides in developing open societies, more pluralistic societies, more tolerant societies, that they are now reverting to forms of leadership that we saw a great deal in the interwar period between the end of the First World War and the Second World War. And we know the dire consequences that brought about for world peace.
Okay. So, with your deep knowledge of Pakistan, what strengths do you see in our society to overcome the several challenges that we face?
Pakistan has going for it because it's been years of turmoil in many respects. It has shown a resilience, which I think is rather remarkable. And yes, it's been fortunate enough to have some national institutions, which I think, although sometimes abused, nevertheless, they stand out as being rather remarkable that you've been able to retain these over the period of time. The shame is, again, that they have at times been abused, been used as instruments of power, of particular individuals seeking power. But this is, I think, really what lies behind Pakistan's strength. Anatole Levin, a very brilliant political scientist, made an observation which I think fits here as well. For Pakistan, and it applies elsewhere, but it certainly applies in Pakistan, what you have here is that the real strength of this system, in a sense, is at the local level, the provincial and the local level. And it's based on societal ties of, yes, some of these are tribal ties. They may be based on qualities that we don't necessarily find laudable, but they do keep the society together. It keeps it from chaos that might otherwise be the case. Now, the problem here is that very strength here, which prevents society from breaking apart, from turning on itself, yes, it even stands in the way of revolutionary change. At the same time, that is a positive development in certain respects. In other ways, it prevents progress. It prevents the reform that may be all too necessary in the society. So it cements things, but in doing so, it also keeps things as they have been, rather than allowing for the opportunities of experimentation and adaptation, which could bring about positive changes.
Okay. So, if peace returns to Afghanistan, Do you see a pluralistic society emerge there? In the past, the country has been at the crossroads of civilization. Can that happen again?
Well, Afghanistan is pluralistic in the sense that certainly in the last 20 years, we've seen lots of interests, lots of voices. They don't speak in unity, but certainly there has been here an opening up. We see it in the number of media outlets. We see it in newspapers. We see it in the development of political parties, although they are more like factions than they are, because they don't compete as political parties as such. So this in one way is healthy, but in the other way, it also detracts from the ability and the necessity to be able to work in common purpose. And that's quite unfortunate, because this is what Afghanistan needs so much of this. Now, the Taliban, you see, represents something which is far less, certainly, pluralistic. It's not based on popular will. It's not based on the notions of representation, responsibility, accountability. These are the qualities that I think that Afghanistan is striving for in its constitution, and has, not succeeded as one would hope. But those qualities are not compatible with what the Taliban is offering, and therefore I'm very skeptical here that there can be power sharing, because this is based on compromise, and the Taliban entered the dialogue saying, we have the answers. It's their version of what is Islamic governance should be like. We have the answers, and if you want to join with us, we'll be inclusive. Everybody can join, but we'll determine how things go. You won't have a voice in that. You have to follow our lead. And that's, and I think we've underestimated this, because we've wanted desperately to see some kind of conclusion to this conflict, which has really been going on in various forms since 1975. And I must say, there are two common threads in this conflict. One of them is that every one of them has been a challenge to the state, largely secular state, a challenge to the state by a more or less extremist Islamic element. Every one of them has this quality. That's been the underlying force here. The other is that outside interference has in every case exaggerated the situation, and has used it to its own advantage. So that combination here of the two has perpetuated what has been not just the America's longest war, but of course probably Afghanistan's longest war too, because these blend into one another, these civil wars which it has been experiencing.
Absolutely, very important. So coming to Iran. Iran is one of the ancient civilizations. Do you see the country draw on its enduring values to re-emerge in the coming years?
Well, Iran has going for it something that few other countries have, certainly in the Middle East. Only Egypt would be the exception. There's no question that they know who they are. Now, this isn't to say all Iranians share the same heritage, because actually it's a fairly pluralistic society, in having Arab population, having Azari population, Turkish speaking, but it is very proud of its heritage. thousands of years. Very proud of this, and whoever they are, we have to recognize in discussing Iran how important this national pride is. And it does keep things together. Now, this has been overlaid by the Islamic Revolution, but even there, they have not really, although they've changed the names of streets in Tehran. I know when I lived in Tehran years ago, virtually every street heralded back to some Shah in the past, some great figure, some poet or so on. So always on the back. Well, you know, that many of those were, if not most of them, were changed to suggest the revolutionary changes that had taken place. Mm-hmm. So this works for Iran. What has not worked for Iran is that there has been kind of leadership which has depended heavily, I think, on its ability to keep the peace through repressive means as well, and also not to underestimate the economic difficulties that it has been facing, which has not been helped by the sanctions which the United States has imposed, and the questionable extension of these at a time of crisis like this. This, I think, I at least find quite regrettable on humanitarian grounds. But nevertheless, Iran has also, in this period of time, not just tried to make for a better society, it has pursued a foreign policy in the region, which I think has been an effort to expand its own version of what an Islamic State is elsewhere, back some groups which clearly practice in terrorism. So it's a very mixed picture with Iran. But my years, in Iran were wonderful. Were wonderful years. In large part because I met, as I have for Pakistan, so many wonderful people. And as in every country, we have to judge ultimately by the people who live there and recognize governments as ones that can come and go.
Dr. Weinbaum, how do you view India's descent into chaos?
Amber, I don't know that it is descending into chaos. I think it is facing these centrifugal forces that can tear it apart. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to suggest that it doesn't have ways to cement this. Despite that, it is a very, very pluralistic society, politically, socially, linguistically, a very difficult society to govern. By contrast, Pakistan is rather homogeneous, and nevertheless has issues as well of these kinds. But it is, and the great wonder is that it holds together. But it does. It does. Many countries hold together because the alternatives. Sorry.
Over several millennia, it has. But
it too has
the campaign of
ideology
against certain groups.
Yeah, and so I don't think Pakistan should base its foreign policy on the thought here that with a little push, India is going to descend. That wouldn't be good for Pakistan no more than chaos in Pakistan would be good for India. The last thing the subcontinent needs now.
In the context of Pakistan or its foreign policy, but in the context of India itself and the social fabric that's been torn apart of people who have been living there for thousands of years are now feeling alienated in that country, in that society.
Absolutely. And what we have here is the emergence of this kind of Hindu nationalism, which you're really alluding to, which has always been there, but has accommodated what has been really an Islamic heritage, certainly with the Mughal Empire, and an Muslim population, which makes it the second largest in the world, and
probably yes, or maybe even the largest. Yes, we don't.
And so that is India is making a great mistake if it follows leadership, which is going to alienate the Muslim population. This is really should be its nightmare, and for that reason should be extending itself here to make sure that its large minority here, its large Islamic minority, feels comfortable within the embraces of what is, yes, largely Hindu society. This is going to come back at India in a big way if it's not very careful.
Okay, so if the US-China rivalry takes on a more visible or belligerent shape, what is your advice for Pakistan?
Well, I think Pakistan has been enormously successful in its foreign policy in being able to balance off adversarial powers. It's done a beautiful job over the years in somehow being close to Saudi Arabia and also necessarily so to Iran. And so it's been able to do this in partly because those countries have never said, well, to be friends with us, you have to turn your back on the other. And I think the same holds true here, too, that Pakistan needs both China and the United States. They are important for different reasons, but they're compatible. If those two countries will make it possible, if those countries make demands on Pakistan and say you've got to choose sides, this would be most unfortunate. And I see some element of that emerging right now. That's very worrisome. Like other countries, they have to be able to find their way, navigate their way, and not get caught up in the competition or even conflicts between other countries. Pakistan cannot afford that. So in its own interests, it has to stand astride from this kind of competition, which has emerged, unfortunately, between the United States and China, who really need one another as well. They've done very well in the last generation or more because they have so integrated economically and have been as willing to stand down and prevent conflicts from emerging of a political or military kind. So Pakistan, I think, is on the right track here, if only the U.S. and China will allow it to stay on that track.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weinbaum. It's been a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, the vastly knowledgeable and insightful Dr. Marvin Weinbaum.